Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters, and for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business, policy, and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. You can check out our show page and all of Safe Camp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web or at safecampaudio on social media. So today we are going to do a few headlines to wrap up 2024, and then we are going to talk to our regular friend of the podcast, Marina Nitze of the Child Welfare Playbook, about the complicated world of the Interstate Compact. Very fun, but important discussion. Let's start the headlines in Washington, D.C., where, of course, there's sort of a dual focus for the moment between what will happen in the final days of the Biden administration and what the Trump administration is shaping up to be, at least in terms of personnel at first in the areas that we focus on, which are, of course, child welfare and youth justice. So let's start there since, to be honest, it's almost entirely speculative at this point, and then we'll move on to the Biden administration's last months here. So here's what I have heard from reputable sources involved at least a bit in the transition process for President-elect Trump. As most people listening know, Trump has announced that Robert F. Kennedy Jr., or RFK Jr., will be his nominee to lead the Department of Health and Human Services, which I believe is the second largest agency behind the Department of Defense in terms of budget and spending. And just a quick refresher as we begin another presidency here, here's sort of the structure of the part of the Department of Health and Human Services that's most relevant from a child welfare services standpoint. So you have ACF, which is the Administration for Children and Families. That is sort of the large division of HHS where most spending and policy around families and children emanate from. So inside of that bigger umbrella, ACF, you have the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which deals with a lot of different circumstances or issues related to immigration and asylum and refugees. One that has become particularly important, to the general child welfare discussion is the Unaccompanied Minors Program there, which is really the only federal foster care program in a sense. This is a program by which we serve young people, teenagers, or even really young children who arrive at the border without a parent, without a caregiver with them. They are taken into custody by immigration, border control, but then they are handed over to the custody of the Department of Health and Human Services and to ORR, who is responsible for finding them a safe place to live while we pursue and identify and vet a safe sponsor for them to live with inside of the country, inside of the United States, while their, asylum or protection hearing starts to go. This was a relatively small program as recently as, I want to say like 2012, a couple $100 million in the broader budget of the Department of Health and Human Services. Now well into the billions every year. And of course, that's as a result of a very large increase in the number of children who arrive at the border unaccompanied. Okay, so let's set that aside because the domestic child welfare really all kind of exists in a different part of ACF. You have another division inside of ACF called the Administration on Children, Youth, and Families, or ACYF. And that is really kind of an umbrella in and of itself of two parts. One is the U.S. Children's Bureau, which has been around for more than 100 years. That is the kind of corner of HHS where billions and billions of dollars, emanates from out to states to pay for things like preventing foster care services, adoption subsidies, and also, policies and rules and regulations related to those things. And then there's a much smaller division called the Family and Youth Services Bureau. The big focal point for that much smaller division of ACYF is youth homeless and runaway services, and then pregnancy prevention for teenagers. Anyway, so of those jobs that I just described, right, because all of those places, the Refugee Resettlement Office, ACYF, Children's Bureau, Family and Youth Services Bureau, leadership at the bigger tent of ACF, those are all going to require people to lead them. And of those jobs, only 2 of those actually require President Trump to, nominate somebody like we think about with the cabinet positions and have them go through a Senate confirmation. And those are the Administration on Children and Families and then ACYF, the division right below that. Then that process takes inherently longer. For example, during the first Trump administration, Lynn Johnson led the bigger agency, Administration for Children and Families. Jerry Milner was the head of the Children's Bureau. Their names were announced basically at the same time. Jerry Milner basically took over right away because his job was not a Senate confirmed one. And Lynn Johnson, it took about a year, I think, before she was put in place officially as the head of ICF. And what they do in those circumstances is somebody kind of within the government bureaucracy typically will take over as the interim head of ACF. Although actually, now that I think about it, the Biden administration did not do that. They put Ju-Yen Chang, who is now a leader at the Doris Duke Foundation, in as an interim leader at ACF. Now I'm getting into the weeds, but so they brought somebody in from outside while they worked through the Senate confirmation with who ultimately led ACF for Biden, and that was January Contreras. So you might think that the top person nominated would have a lot to do with filling in the team below them, right? So in this situation, you think, oh, well, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is the pick to lead the Department of Health and Human Services, so he'll put together his own team. That's not necessarily the case. Really, the transition team for a president-elect has a lot more to do with that. They've got, people who are kind of like just as soon as the election is deemed final, sort of working to, or even really before that, figure out who are good candidates for different spots. So it's really not the person who's going to lead the cabinet agency that gets to just decide who goes in with them. But in this case, as far as we can tell, there really isn't anything that resembles a normal transition process going on, with some announced list of allies and experts working on various agencies or things like that. I have heard from people that are involved and, being consulted or asked about things from the transition team that such that it exists, that is pretty consolidated to a group that are operating out of Mar-a-Lago, and that RFK Jr. is actually quite hands-on in leading the HHS transition. So which in a weird way means, he'll maybe help shape an agency leadership team that he won't end up in charge of, since he's viewed as a fairly controversial candidate for the job. So all that to say, our intel thus far is that there's already a pick for the top, what you'd call child welfare job, and that's the head of the Administration for Children and Families. We don't know who that is, but apparently it's been decided. That's what I've heard. I think the safe bet is that it's going to be several months until we really hear names for a lot of these places. Wouldn't be surprising if you started to see, people get nominated for jobs as high up as the ACF job by February or maybe March, something like that. So I think we'll hold off as I try to get a sense of who might actually be more specific candidates that are being vetted. If you just think about it from the perspective of like who are likely suspects to take leadership positions, with ACF, that's as a Senate confirmable job, that's got some profile. It's not, Secretary of the Health and Human Services Department like RFK Jr. has, but, it's got a little bit of profile to it, and you'd have a confirmation hearing and you'd be out there a little bit. That's the one where you could maybe see somebody with a little bit more celebrity status, let's say, or reputation get brought in for it. Think about another person that the Trump team has announced, Dr. Oz, famous from television, famous author, famous surgeon, who's going to lead the Centers on Medicare and Medicaid Services, another fairly high-profile part of the government. I was joking around with somebody that who would the equivalent of Dr. Oz be for, Family and Youth Services? I guess Dr. Phil would be the other one, TV doctor. But I don't have any. I'm not saying that with any conviction, like I know anything about it. But I guess that's the one where you could see something like that happening. As far as the other positions go, you'd have to think that, state and county agency leaders who are Republican, or at least who voted for Trump, would be candidates for these jobs. Also got to think about, people from conservative leaning think tanks, your American Enterprise Institute or Manhattan Institute, those types. But I guess you could see a judge or maybe somebody from a faith-based organization get put into some of these places. So, we'll head into 2025 with our ear to the ground trying to report for our readers and listeners on who might be in play for these. And I'm talking a lot about child welfare. Obviously, on the other side of the coin, there's really one job, maybe two in the federal government that are very specifically related to juvenile justice and youth justice. The most specific one is obviously the administrator for the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. Currently, that is Liz Ryan. Before her, during the Trump administration, it was a woman named Karen Harp. So that is not a Senate confirmed job. They could bring somebody in day one and just have them get started there. We will see on that one. I guess the other one would be that person's boss, who is the head of the Office of Justice Programs. And that's a much bigger, multi-billion-dollar budget at the Department of Justice. So that's a person that could choose to make youth and juvenile justice a focal point. I guess I would say that Lori Robinson during the Obama administration was a person at OJP who, really did focus somewhat on youth. Others have not. I honestly don't remember if the Trump team even had a confirmed person in that job the entire time they were there. I'll have to look back and see at that. But, we'll keep the intel coming as much as we can get it as these guys start to roll out and get announced. Now, as for the Biden administration, obviously we are in the middle of December or heading into the middle of December. There's not a lot of time left. Christmas and the new year and the holiday season is going to take up a lot of that. So I don't think it would be rational to expect that there's going to be a ton happening within the child welfare youth justice range. You could just see, some things that have maybe been in the process. I'm tea leaf reading here. This is just like a guess, but I could see a situation where, maybe they have a pile of things that they were hoping to get done and decide on one or two that they're going to really put their remaining effort in to get across the finish line as they prepare to vacate the White House and the executive branch. That definitely happened in the Obama administration where, I think there was like a reasonable amount of surprise that Trump won, and then they quickly moved to try and finalize some things that they thought, frankly, they were going to be able to hand over for continuation to what they thought would be the Hillary Clinton administration. So what's in this bucket? Well, one thing got taken out of it actually last week, and I'll link to our story that we wrote up about this. But one of the kind of lingering things out there was that there's this very long saga of the attempt that started really in 2016 to start to include the Indian Child Welfare Act into what is regularly collected as federal data by the federal government. So we have a system, it's called the Adoption and Foster Care Reporting and Analysis System, or AFCARS. To date, it has not included any information about, different data elements or characteristics of cases where the Indian Child Welfare Act applies, even though the Indian Child Welfare Act is, predates almost all federal policy and legislation around child welfare. So as I was just kind of referencing, the Obama administration, sort of like at the end of their term, like sort of in the December, January area, they finalized a huge swath of updates to that AFCARS system. And it included, I would say, the majority of what they were proposing to add and finalize. They also put in several data elements around identifying the sexual orientation and gender identity of children who are involved in foster care, also their parents of those kids. They had things about educational stability in there. There's a few that I'm forgetting. Broken adoptions, failed adoptions. Basically, the Obama administration attempt was to sort of try to catch up on all the incorporation of like things that had become law since the last time they had updated AFCAR, as well as ICWA, which had just simply never been added into it. Anyway, that's all to say that rule was frozen by the Trump team and then rolled back, and then they finalized their own version of collecting information about the Indian Child Welfare Act that was much more limited. It greatly reduced the amount of sort of data points and elements we were going to get in terms of what we would know about ICWA cases. So that prompted a lawsuit. There was a kind of a team, a group of advocates for LGBTQ youth and Native American tribes who basically challenged the Trump administration's decision to freeze the Obama rule, get rid of the ICWA elements or a lot of them, and then get rid of entirely the sexual orientation and gender identity aspects of additions to AFCARs. Okay, so that basically went through the entire Trump term. Actually, the Biden administration was sort of put in this weird position where they were, they inherited that lawsuit, so they were kind of like defending it for a little while. The challengers lost that lawsuit, but there was sort of this implied, agreement that the Biden administration was going to reissue rulemaking around adding all of this stuff back into AFCARs. And what they did in this, again, I'll link to our story from last week about this, is that they have gotten through the more robust collection of Indian Child Welfare Act information. So that is finalized. Because it's so late in the process, there is a chance that the Trump administration will choose to again freeze this rule. I don't think it would be targeted at this. I think it would be maybe collateral damage if the general, Trump administration view is like, we're going to freeze everything that happened in the last couple of months, because they do have the right to do that and then review it. So there is a chance of that. But the Biden administration did finish that up. They finalized that rule. I have heard that the sexual orientation and gender identity rulemaking process, they haven't even put out a proposed rule for that yet. When they did that, if they did that, let's say they did that sometime this month or next, there is a period, a public comment period, essentially where they would have to listen to and hear views from states and private citizens and organizations about the rules that they had promulgated. And then they would have to finalize a rule that incorporates that public comment and sort of comments on the comments, right? So that's sort of how the rulemaking process goes. There is zero chance that all of that will happen in the next, month and a half. I don't even think there was actual time for that to happen, even if every day was spent on it. It is possible that, I guess, symbolically, they could put out what they would have as a proposed rule. I've heard that this has been written, it's in the process, and it's under legal review. So hard to say where that will all land. I guess it's possible that they could put that out. My sense is that would be largely symbolic, because I don't think there's any chance that the Trump administration would move to finalize that rule and incorporate sexual orientation and gender identity into what we know or collect about youth who are in foster care through the AFCAR system. But, I guess that is one thing that they could do, is sort of put out, at least just for discussion purposes, how they would go about collecting information about sexual orientation and gender identity. So that's one thing. I think the last time we did a little headlines review, I talked a little bit about how the administration had not acted on anything related to protecting the Social Security benefits for foster youth. These come by way of disability, or because a parent or both parents had died and so they were owed, survivor benefits. So, there's almost certainly not going to be action on that, but they did put out sort of a call for information. It's they put out I think it's just formally called like a request for information with some specific questions, and they wanted some state and youth feedback and from different parties on how the federal government could do a better job or improve the protection of these benefits for kids. So it would be interesting to see if maybe they could quickly take at least some amount of what they have gotten over the last month or so and put that out before they wrap things up. I think the other one I'll be paying attention to is if there's anything they want to do around at least clarifying or discussing with the child welfare community kind of the rules and process around reviews related to the Family First Prevention Services Act, specifically about the clearinghouse process. This is kind of wonky stuff, but there's been some frustration with the speed and transparency of the government and its contractor, which is Abt Associates, when it comes to reviewing candidates for this money. And just quickly, what I'm talking about is the front end of the Family First Act, which allows for states to draw in federal money to help with services that are aimed at preventing foster care. So if a case comes up and there's a determination, generally that, either abuse or neglect has occurred, or that a child's at imminent risk of that happening, you can start now to spend federal dollars and a match to provide services aimed at preventing that from happening, or preventing foster care from becoming necessary in those cases. So that's what it's really about. Anyway, the Biden administration has kind of overseen a little bit of an update to the handbook on how all this stuff gets reviewed and how the reviews are explained and all of those things. So, my sense I've heard is that, they're hoping that the Trump administration will pick up the ball and continue to sort of enlighten people a little bit more on what all is going on with that. But I guess maybe you could see, even just if it's like a letter to states or something on that level from the remaining leadership. I know Rebecca Jones-Gaston, who leads the administration on children, youth, and families, ACYF, is still hanging around, and from what I heard, intends to stick around until the very last day. I know this is something that she's been passionate about. They brought her in. She led Maryland's child welfare system for a time. She led Oregon's for a time. Both of those states were among the first to kind of bring in the Family First Act, opt into it, get a plan together, and start to, make use of the preventative services. So I think that this is something that she'll want to do what she can before the lights go out. So last thing out of Washington, D.C. real quick, and this one is about somebody who is being sent to Washington, D.C. Just wanted to call this out because it was a nice memory for me personally. In 2004, I was still a very young reporter at Youth Today when I had my first full in-depth interview, and it was with a woman named Lateefah Simon, who was herself a very young advocate at the time. She became a single mom at age 18. By 19, she was the executive director of an organization called the Young Women's Freedom Center in San Francisco. She won a MacArthur Genius Award at a very young age, so I had sat down to do an interview with her. I think I was the first person after Oprah to interview her at the time. Anyway, I mention all that because Lateefah Simon, now age 47, is going to be Representative Lateefah Simon soon. She was elected to fill the seat of longtime Democratic Representative Barbara Lee to represent a portion of the Bay Area of the 12th Congressional District of California. I'll try to scare up my 2-decade-old interview with Miss Simon and put that into the show notes for anybody that might want to read what it was like back then and what she was working on. And I'll definitely include a link to Jeremy Loudenbeck of the Imprint's profile of Representative Simon from back in March. All right, so let's close out with a few stories from the Imprint and elsewhere that I thought were interesting. And we're going to start with our own Sara Tiano's 2-parter on moms relying on addiction medications, often called medication-assisted treatment, or MAT, who get unfairly entangled with Child Protective Services. So medication-assisted treatment, that is widely accepted now in the medical community as critical to recovery and sobriety. And the federal government has recognized as much, including in its child welfare policy. We talked a little bit about the Family First Act and the prevention services that have been approved for states to tap into, child welfare entitlements to pay for efforts to prevent foster care. One of the early additions to that is methadone maintenance treatment, which is a whole, pathway of helping people to gain sobriety and to battle addiction that, really starts with medication-assisted treatment. And yet there still seems to be erratic policies around the use of MAT by parents when it comes to decisions around removals, and also, and perhaps more so, around reunification with parents after a child's already been in foster care. So really what we're talking about is, does the presence of a prescribed use of medication to fight, an addiction to opioids or something else actually becoming a factor in a child welfare case where removal might be on the table or an investigation is on the table, or if a child's already in foster care, does a parent's use of medication-assisted treatment, I'm really having a hard time saying that today, or in cases where reunification is the pathway that's been planned by the child welfare system, for a child that's already in foster care, does a parent's use of MAT create a barrier to that reunification? So part one of the series, Sara delves into the topic more broadly. And then in part two, she looks at one New York mom who actually filed a lawsuit after hospital staff got CPS involved in her case after she voluntarily disclosed that she was on medical assisted treatment, or MAT. The second story I want to call out is from the Post-Crescent in Wisconsin. And, we see a lot of versions of this story in local news, basically a piece kind of calling attention to the need for foster families in various communities. This one just caught my eye because it identified a point of concern for child welfare officials in Wisconsin, that in 2022, the state had 240 treatment foster care homes, and treatment foster care homes are licensed to handle children with particularly acute need that requires some level of specialization. That might be neurodivergence or mental health issues. It might be really complex physical medical needs. So there were 240 of those homes in 2022. Today, there are 168. And so why I think that's, worth mentioning here on the podcast, and I'll link people to the story if they want to read it, is because as we've talked about quite a few times, there's a, continuing interest in lowering the number of children in foster care who need to go to residential treatment facilities or group homes, congregate care. This is a general kind of term to describe all of those things. One solution to, getting us to a lower number of kids in those situations is to have homes available with people who are equipped and trained to handle really complicated cases, because that is, at the end of the day, a big group of what we're talking about is teenagers who may have, very serious behavioral health needs, or young kids who've got really complicated medical situations going on. That latter group are not the ones that are most likely to end up in residential care, but it's certainly the case that teenagers who let's say your average foster family or an untrained kinship care provider may struggle with, these treatment foster homes are, kind of generally believed to be like the way out to lower the number of kids who are going into congregate care. And, the fact that in a state like Wisconsin, the number has gone down and not up is of concern, if we're going to be moving in that direction. So thought it was an interesting one to share a link to. Third story I wanted to call out is entitled "The Survivors of Child Sex Abuse Who Don't Want Their Abusers Punished." And it was written by Roxana Asgharian, whose name is probably familiar to our listeners and readers. She's reported for the Imprint before. We've interviewed her on this podcast about her book, We Were Once a Family, from a couple years ago now. This was written for the New Republic, and it explores efforts to help people who experience sexual abuse as children heal, and kind of looks at the mismatch, at least for some victims, of the concept of a law and order result in their situation and the concept of closure. I don't know how better to describe it. Asgharian hones in on one Michigan woman, Tashmika Torak. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. The survivor of abuse herself, who worked with victims and their families through therapy and trauma-informed yoga. I say she worked with, through her organization, the Firecracker Foundation, because that actually, the nonprofit closes doors, although Tashmika continues to consult for other groups. So it is a thought-provoking read for sure. This is a very complicated issue when it comes down to it. Asgharian is exploring the organizations and the people who are thinking about and centering the needs of a victim. You've got as well the societal need to have a response to people who, perpetrate child sex abuse. And you've got sort of the third element, which is how victims feel about that process. And, frankly, on some level, how they feel about the process should dictate how it goes. So I think she's really grappling with a complicated issue, and I think I would recommend a read of this one. I think it's interesting. All right, last one I wanted to call out today was the Imprint's Jeremy Loudenbeck reporting on some really stunning data about suicidality and youth who are in foster care or youth who have recently experienced foster care in their adult years. So what this study found that Jeremy is looking at is that roughly 1/4 of young adults in foster care in California have attempted suicide, and their rate of suicidal behavior is 3 times that of peers who are not in government care. That is according to this recent published study. Colleen Katz, who is an associate professor at Hunter College, who worked on this study, told Jeremy, these numbers jumped off the page. This is something that we urgently need to understand better. So I will drop a link to Jeremy's story into the show notes. Really alarming numbers for sure within this study. All right, when we come back, we will talk to Marina Nitze, the Child Welfare Playbook, about the Interstate Compact.
Hi, everyone. It's journalist Lisa Ling, and I'm sure you will agree that it is so important for there to be good, trustworthy journalism on children and families, and nobody does that better than the Imprint. I am such a devotee of the Imprint, and I listen to the Imprint weekly podcast because it is so comprehensive and so substantive, and it is by far the best news source for anyone interested in critical issues like foster care, juvenile justice, youth homelessness, and so much more. During this holiday season of giving, I hope you'll consider donating to the Imprint. If you do so between now and the end of the year, your donation will be doubled thanks to the National Newsmatch campaign. To give is so easy. Go to imprintnews.org/donate. That's imprintnews.org/donate. Thank you so much.
Before we wrap up, as I'm trying to make customary on the headlines episode of each month, we have Marina Nitze, author of Hack Your Bureaucracy, doer of many things, including being a driving force behind the Child Welfare Playbook, which is a group of state child welfare leaders that routinely get together to problem solve, learn about promising solutions in other places. Last month, we talked to Marina about kinship care and background checks. Today, we are talking about Interstate Compact on the placement of children, often referred to just as ICPC, which every time I hear of it, I think of Insane Clown Posse. I'm in Michigan.
Well, that's going to change my image of every time I see ICPC now.
I know. How you doing?
Oh, I'm good. How are you? Thanks for having me back.
I'm doing good. I should also say Marina is the owner of a very cute new dog. Is that we're talking on Halloween? Is Fiona going to be in a costume tonight?
I saw a cute Hershey kiss you can make out of saran wrap, so it's not too late to get her dressed up.
Okay, so Interstate Compact on the placement of children. Let's not go way down into the weeds about what that is, but I'll tee it up for you. You can do maybe a little better explanation. But at the end of the day, there are many instances in which children come into foster care or they're going to get adopted, and those things are going to take place in 2 states. The incident that prompted a removal might happen in Michigan. The right person to care for the child might be in Ohio. And so the ICPC has been created to facilitate the very important need of one state to make sure that the other state is providing a safe environment. There's paperwork, there's process on both sides. That is ICPC. What did I miss?
Yeah, no, that's it. And the thing I don't know, always think about with ICPC though, is think about if you live on a state border, right? Like your grandma or your school teacher might even live across the street effectively, but that's across a state border. And so that might involve ICPC too.
Totally. And I think, why it is worth kind of talking about what you guys have had conversations about here. Obviously, it's important all the time, but, 2 things kind of worth considering in the Interstate Compact land is, as more and more systems come to rely on and use kin more often, I think it's rational to assume that the amount of kids moved to another state is likely to increase, right? Like maybe not in total number because, for several years now, the number of kids in foster care overall has been going down. But, as a percentage, I would say that's fairly likely, right? You're more likely as a state to use foster parents in your own state. As we use kin more, I think it's more likely that you'll see that percentage go up, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially as more and more agencies start embracing more kin mobilization techniques. I think it's been common for a long time that if, an aunt and uncle live out of state, that they are not considered as an immediate placement or a short-term placement option. And I'm starting to see that change. So absolutely, we could start seeing more ICPC in that context too.
There you go. And then connected to that, as we discussed with Marina last week, there's these new kinship standards we've done quite a bit on the podcast about that the Biden administration finalized. I'd say probably likely that, there'll be more kinship related legislation going forward, more policymaking. So these are people right on both sides of the state coin. They have whole offices sometimes, or at least, specialists devoted to ICPC. That's a whole bunch of people that you have to make sure know the rules of the road and how things are changing. So probably.
Yeah, we were really lucky to partner with APHSA this last month, talked with tens of ICPC administrators around the country about hey, how are you seeing the new kin-specific licensing standards play out in ICPC? Yeah. And, they really underscored the importance for all of you out there that are in the process of doing your kin licensing standards to loop in your ICPC team early and often, because as excited as we all are about how kin licensing should enable more kin placements and less administrative burden, in the world of ICPC, it's going to cause, some potential confusion for a while, as every state's got to keep track of every other state's changing over the next year. And there's questions, hey, if this state goes live on December 12th, but the ICPC request comes in on December 8th, how do you handle those? It's totally a solvable question, but you got to plan ahead. You got to make sure your ICPC page is updated. You got to make sure you have a communication plan with other states. And so for that purpose, making sure you loop in your ICPC folks early and often is definitely a promising practice.
As we were kind of emailing to prep about this, you mentioned that, in your experience, because you've talked to a lot of systems in a lot of different ways, that folks in the ICCP office tend to be some of the more risk averse that you come across. Do you think that's just kind of innate in the job because their job is to check safety on some level? Or do you find that they are unnecessarily so in a way where more information can unburden them of that? What's your sense of that?
I think ICPC folks are in a rough spot. They have to keep track of very tight compliance rules across a bunch of other states. So, you could imagine being a licensing worker in an agency and, you have a complicated situation with grandma and you can work that through with your supervisor or even their supervisor. That gets infinitely more complex when you're crossing state lines and trying to get exceptions made. And of course, ICPC is really prioritizing, child safety, and as they should. And so really something we wanted to emphasize and remind everybody is that the background check rules have not changed for kin. The background checks rules are still the same. A lot of this new kin licensing world is about making it more accessible, right? More community-based fingerprinting locations, holistically considering a kin's background, but it's not, just to really underline, we're not removing any background check steps for kinship caregivers.
Okay. So, part of the magic of how what the Child Welfare Playbook and what Marina does is they convene these people who might be facing their own unique barriers or something they think is a barrier in one state, whereas some other jurisdiction has kind of been oh, we have a way around that, or we have figured out way around that's not the right phrase. Let me walk that back. A different way of approaching something. So talk to me about this session of the playbook. What did you hear from states? What's on their minds when it comes to ICPC, and what seemed exciting about new ideas and approaches?
Yeah, we heard a lot of enthusiasm from ICPC team members about how they expect to make kin placements more efficiently without sacrificing, of course, any safety steps, but getting kids to permanency and to kinship faster. We especially heard, from places like Alaska, where they're really hopeful that as more and more places adopt the kin-specific licensing standards, that more people will recognize the diverse needs of different families. We heard stories of, for example, kinship caregivers in Alaska who live on permafrost, where you can't have indoor plumbing because you can't plumb through the permafrost. And you can't really have a bed frame because it is so prohibitively expensive to have furniture delivered. So yeah, you might be technically sleeping on the floor, but this is a loving, safe family. And that's that child's family, right? So sometimes when we apply a checklist that may have been designed in a different state, in a different environment, it can be really hard to do something like an ICPC in a different community. And so we really heard it underlined and emphasized, which I could not love more, that, families come in all shapes and sizes, and you can be a safe, loving, stable placement, even if, technically you don't have a bed frame or other 2 points of egress from your bedroom and other things. And so there was a lot of hope that the new kin licensing standards can help enable more kin placements, in and out of ICPC. So that was definitely exciting to hear. I definitely also heard, as every, state in the next territory and Title 40 tribe is changing their licensing standards in the next couple of years, this is a great time to shake loose some of the other barriers that have been in place One of them that we heard loud and clear was about Medicaid eligibility around ICPC. And there's some states that because of their Medicaid plan, when a child is placed there through ICPC, they no longer have access to health care. And that can be a barrier in and of itself. Right now, that child can't have health insurance. So maybe they're not going to be able to make that move at all. And this is something that I would love to dive into. Maybe John, you and I could do it together a little like, which are these states that have this? And, I doubt it's out of malice, right? But like maybe they have not even realized that it's a barrier in their plan, because this is like the out-of-state child abuse and neglect registry checks that we talked about last time. This is one of those things that you don't experience in your state. You experience it when you're another state interacting with your state. So it can be really hard to see.
So the issue is the youth in foster care's Medicaid eligibility is changed when they go across the state line. It seems
correct,
like
because that receiving state.
Yeah.
The receiving state, as it was explained to me, like depending on their plan, they will not cover, for example, as this audience knows, not every child in foster care is Title IV eligible, right? So it may be that the receiving state will not cover Medicaid for a non-Title IV child, even though they're in foster care. And then there were a couple other examples brought up to me as well. So I'd love to dive into that next year and maybe make, it's not part of kin licensing, but it's ultimately part of kin support, is making sure that all kids in foster care have access to health care, no matter where they're placed.
That's very interesting, because my understanding is not that the categorical eligibility of a foster youth to Medicaid has anything to do with their 4E status. It is their status as a foster youth. So that puts it in a weird box of, is this legal? Or at the very least, what are you hearing happens in those cases? Is the sending state covering Medicaid somehow back in the place the kid
it
is
varies.
Yeah.
Sometimes the sending state has found creative ways to cover it. Sometimes the sending state has found creative ways to get that child healthcare in another way. Like maybe that the caregiver's company would provide like insurance for a dependent. And then sometimes the kid has no health insurance. I heard those stories directly over the last month. This child has been placed and they have no health insurance and haven't for a long time. And then I think the final category that is probably not measured is how many ICPC placements aren't being made at all because the child needs healthcare and can't get it in the receiving state.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So it's kind of both problems. If they land in that new state, they don't have healthcare, or it can be a barrier to landing in the right place. If everybody agrees.
Absolutely. But this feels really solvable. So I want to be hopeful about this, that if maybe we can get our arms around the places that need to update their Medicaid plans, we can do that.
That was what I was going to ask you next, and we can wrap up on that. Is, if I'm hearing you right, the issue is not, well, we don't want to take on that added expense. It's just a procedural, when I try to do the paperwork, I'm being blocked. Because
it's my understanding it's like a detailed nuance in the Medicaid plan of the receiving state that I, again, believe is fixable. And it might be one of those things that since the state isn't experiencing it for themselves, some of them may not. If the ICPC office knows it's a problem, that might not necessarily be getting to the person that can change Medicaid plans, which is an entire different agency.
Yeah. And I mean, not even trying to be a jerk, but I mean, fixable or then litigatable, if not, I would think, because if you're being denied Medicaid and you're categorically eligible, I don't think that's allowed. So, yeah.
I think there's all tools for change, but let's start with helping the places that want to fix it. Yeah.
For sure. All right. Okay. So this has been the Marina Nitze Corner for this week. We'll come up with a better name. She's repping Child Welfare Playbook when she comes on. So thank you, Marina, for joining us, and we'll hopefully get you back next month.
Thanks, John. Always happy to chat with you.
Thanks to Marina Nitze of the Child Welfare Playbook for joining us today. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at safecampaudio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Onjoko with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you'd consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it's super easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow the Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @theImprintNews, and you can visit us on the web at imprintnews.org or email us at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.